I never thought my own son would be the one to push me down the basement stairs, but he did. And while I lay there at the bottom, staring up at the ceiling, I realized something terrifying. He thought I was weak. What he didn't know was that before he ever laid a hand on me, I had already prepared for the worst. And one phone call from that hospital bed changed everything. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube. I never imagined that the child I carried for 9 months, the boy whose fevers I sat through, whose scraped knees I kissed, whose nightmares I chased away with lullabies, would one day look at me as if I were an inconvenience, a burden, something in the way of what he wanted. But life has a way of revealing truths slowly, like paint peeling from a wall you thought was solid. And by the time I saw the cracks in my son Daniel, they were already too deep to repair. I raised Daniel alone. His father walked out when Daniel was 5 years old, leaving behind a stack of unpaid bills and a promise to send money that never came. I worked 2 jobs for years. I cleaned houses in the mornings and folded laundry at a small motel in the evenings. There were nights I skipped dinner so Daniel could have seconds. There were winters when my coat had holes in the lining, but his was new and warm. I never complained. I never regretted it. He was my pride, my proof that love could build something strong. When Daniel graduated from college, I cried harder than anyone in that auditorium. I remember gripping the armrest and whispering, "We did it," because to me, his success was ours. He got a good job in the city, he moved out, he called every Sunday at first, then every other week, then whenever he remembered. I told myself that was normal. Children grow up, they build their own lives. That's how it should be. Then 3 years ago, Daniel lost his job. He said the company downsized. He sounded embarrassed when he told me. I didn't hesitate. I told him to come home. Just until you get back on your feet, I said. I meant it with my whole heart. The first few months were fine. He helped with groceries, he mowed the lawn, he fixed the loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen. Sometimes we even sat together in the evenings and watched television like we used to. I felt grateful. Maybe, I thought, this was a second chance at closeness. But slowly, something shifted. It began with small comments. "You know this house is too big for you, Mom." Or, "Have you ever thought about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage?" I brushed them off. This house wasn't just walls and floors. It was 25 years of memories. It was Daniel's height marked in pencil in the hallway wall. It was the kitchen where we baked his first birthday cake. I wasn't ready to leave it. Then the paperwork started appearing. One afternoon, I came home from my book club to find a stack of documents neatly arranged on the dining table. Daniel was sitting there, tapping a pen against his palm. He smiled too quickly when he saw me. "Mom, I've been looking into estate planning," he said. "You really should get this sorted out." I laughed lightly. "I already have a will, sweetheart." He frowned. "That's old. You need something updated. It would just make things easier later." "Easier for who?" I asked without thinking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid one of the papers toward me and pointed to a highlighted section. "It just transfers the house into joint ownership for convenience." Convenience. That word sat heavy in my chest. I told him I would think about it. He didn't like that answer. His jaw tightened just for a second. It was subtle, but I saw it. I've known his expressions since he was a baby. After that, the comments became sharper. He started correcting me in front of people. "Mom forgets things lately," he'd say with a forced chuckle. "I have to keep an eye on her." He said it at the grocery store once when I reached for the wrong brand of cereal. He said it to the neighbor when I forgot where I'd put my reading glasses. I laughed along, but inside, something felt wrong. I wasn't forgetful. I was 72, yes, but my mind was clear. I paid my bills on time, I balanced my checkbook, I remembered every birthday in the family without writing it down. Yet Daniel began speaking to me as if I were fragile glass. He also began isolating me in small ways. He offered to handle my banking so I wouldn't have to go out. He suggested I cancel my weekly book club because those women just fill your head with nonsense. He even hinted that maybe driving at night wasn't safe for me anymore. It was subtle, always subtle. The first time he raised his voice, it startled me. I had refused to sign one of the documents he left out again. "You don't trust me," he snapped, "after everything I've done for you." I stared at him. "Everything you've done for me?" He ran a hand through his hair and paced the kitchen. "I moved back here to help you." "I moved back here because you needed help," I said quietly. The air between us thickened. For a moment, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. Calculation. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I told myself he was stressed, unemployed, frustrated. I told myself he was still my boy. But a small voice in my heart whispered that something else was growing inside him, something resentful. Over the next few months, I began noticing other things. He'd linger near me when I checked the mail. He'd ask detailed questions about my savings. He'd remind me how expensive repairs on old houses could be. If something happens to you suddenly, everything could get tied up in probate for years. Something happens to you suddenly. The words echoed long after he left the room. I didn't confront him. Instead, I did something else, something quiet, something he never suspected. But I wasn't fast enough, because the night he pushed me down those basement stairs, I realized just how far he was willing to go. And as I lay at the bottom, pain blooming through my body like fire, I heard his voice above me say, "Mom, it was an accident." And I knew it wasn't. The fall did not feel dramatic the way it does in movies. There was no slow motion, no time to scream. One second, I was standing at the top of the basement stairs arguing with my son, and the next, my heel slipped forward and the world tilted violently beneath me. I remember the sensation of weightlessness first, then the sickening crack as my shoulder struck the edge of a step. My hip hit next, then my head. And then there was nothing but a blur of wood and darkness. When I finally stopped moving, I was lying twisted on the concrete floor at the bottom. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The air had been knocked from my lungs, and pain spread through my ribs like something alive. I stared up at the rectangle of light at the top of the staircase. Daniel's silhouette blocked part of it. "Mom?" he called down, his voice high and strained. "Mom, are you okay?" I tried to answer, but all that came out was a small, broken sound. He rushed down the steps then, carefully. Too carefully. I noticed that even through the pain. He avoided the edges of the stairs, placed his feet deliberately. He knelt beside me and touched my shoulder. I flinched. "It was an accident," he said quickly. "You slipped." I forced myself to look at him. My vision swam, but I could still see his face. There was fear there, yes, but underneath it, something else. Not panic, not horror, calculation again. "You pushed me," I whispered. His hand tightened slightly against my arm. "No, Mom, you lost your balance. I barely touched you." Barely touched you. But I remembered. I remembered the heat in his voice just seconds before. I remembered telling him I would not sign the papers. I remembered turning away from him to end the argument. And I remembered the sharp force between my shoulder blades. Not a brush, not a slip, a push. The pain in my hip intensified when I tried to move, a sharp white agony that made me gasp. "Don't move," he said quickly. "I'll call an ambulance." He pulled his phone from his pocket and stepped away from me as he dialed. I listened to his voice as he spoke to the operator. He sounded breathless, frightened, convincing. "My mom fell down the basement stairs. She slipped. She's hurt pretty bad." He glanced at me as he said the word slipped. I closed my eyes. As we waited, the basement felt colder than usual. I could hear the hum of the old water heater, the faint ticking of the overhead light. I thought about how many times I had walked down those stairs over the years to switch laundry, to store Christmas decorations, to bring up jars of peaches I'd canned myself. I had never once fallen. Now, here I was at the bottom, my body throbbing, my son standing above me rewriting what had just happened. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Their boots were loud against the steps. They asked questions. Daniel answered most of them before I could. "She's been a little unsteady lately," he added casually. "I keep telling her to let me handle things." Unsteady. I opened my eyes and forced myself to speak. "He pushed me." The words were thin, barely louder than the buzzing in my ears. One of the paramedics leaned closer. "Ma'am?" Daniel's head snapped toward me. His expression hardened for just a second before he smoothed it over. "Mom, don't start that. You know you slipped." "I didn't slip," I insisted, though the effort made my vision blur. The paramedic's eyes flickered between us. I saw uncertainty there, but also hesitation. It's hard to accuse someone's own child, hard to believe it. They strapped me onto a stretcher. The movement sent bolts of pain through my hip and shoulder. I bit down on a cry. As they carried me up the stairs, I looked at Daniel one more time. He followed closely behind, his face pale, his mouth set in a thin line. In the ambulance, I stared at the ceiling and tried to piece together what had happened in the minutes before the fall. We had been arguing in the kitchen again. He had brought up the house again, said that I was being selfish for not thinking about the future. I told him the future did not belong to him while I was still alive. He followed me toward the basement door because I said I was done discussing it. I remember his footsteps heavy behind me. I remember reaching for the railing, and then that force. At the hospital, the lights were too bright. The questions came too fast. Doctors, nurses, forms, signatures. My hip was fractured, my shoulder dislocated. I would need surgery, I would need rehabilitation. Daniel stayed close, hovering at my bedside. When doctors asked how it happened, he answered smoothly. "She slipped." Each time I corrected him. He pushed me. The first few times the staff exchanged looks but said little. Accidents happen, elderly people fall, families misunderstand. But I saw the irritation in Daniel's eyes each time I spoke. I saw the tightening of his jaw. When they finally wheeled me into a room alone for imaging and he was asked to wait outside, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. The pain in my body was real, the fracture on the scan was real, and so was the memory of his hands against my back. As I lay there waiting to be taken to surgery, I made a decision. If my own son was willing to push me down a flight of stairs for a house, then I could no longer afford to be silent. I could no longer afford to hope he would come back to the boy I raised. Because the boy I raised would have thrown himself down those stairs before letting me fall. When the nurse stepped out to prepare paperwork, she left my phone on the small rolling table beside my bed. Daniel had handed it over earlier without thinking. He believed I was weak. He believed I was confused. He believed he still had time. But as the door clicked shut and I reached slowly for my phone with trembling fingers, I knew something he didn't. I had already started preparing for this moment, and now it was time to make one call. My hands were shaking, but not from confusion, not from weakness, from clarity. Pain radiated through my hip in steady pulses, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. I scrolled through my contacts slowly, careful not to drop the phone onto the hospital floor. Daniel had saved his own number under emergency, just in case something ever happened to me. I almost laughed at that. Instead, I tapped on another name, Margaret Ellis. She answered on the third ring, her voice calm and steady as always. "Margaret speaking." "It's me," I whispered. There was a pause, then a shift in her tone. "Helen, why are you whispering?" "I'm at St. Andrew's Hospital," I said carefully. "Daniel pushed me down the basement stairs." The silence on the other end of the line was not disbelief, it was calculation. "Are you safe right now?" she asked. "For the moment." "Is he with you?" "Outside the room." Another pause, then Margaret inhaled slowly. "All right, listen carefully. I need you to answer me clearly. Was this intentional?" "Yes." "Good," she said firmly. "I believe you." Those 3 words nearly broke me. I didn't realize how much I needed someone to say them. Margaret had been my attorney for almost 2 years now, quietly, without Daniel knowing. The first time I visited her office, I told her I only wanted to update my will, but as I sat across from her polished wooden desk, something inside me had spilled out. I told her about the paperwork Daniel kept pressuring me to sign, about the way he spoke to me in front of others, about how he lingered when I handled my bank statements. Margaret never once dismissed my concerns as paranoia. Instead, she asked careful questions. She reviewed my original will. She reviewed my property deed. She explained options I hadn't even known existed. And that was when we made changes. Now, lying in that hospital bed, I finally understood why my instincts had pushed me to act early. "Margaret," I said softly, "it's time." "I agree. I'll initiate everything today." I closed my eyes briefly. "And the footage?" "It's secure," she said, backed up and time-stamped, multiple copies. Relief washed through me like cool water. 6 months earlier, after one particularly heated argument about transferring the house into joint ownership, I had done something Daniel never suspected. I had installed security cameras, small ones, discreet, one near the front door, one in the kitchen, and one positioned high in the hallway that angled toward the basement entrance. Daniel thought the small blinking light near the door was a dummy camera. He even joked once about how I was too paranoid to understand modern technology. He never realized it was recording. The day the cameras were installed, I felt foolish, dramatic, like I was overreacting, but Margaret had advised it gently. Documentation protects you, even from family. Especially from family, I now thought. "Helen," Margaret continued, "once you're stable, I want you to formally report this. I can arrange for an officer to come to the hospital if necessary, but we will not rush until you're medically safe." "I already told the paramedic." "Good. Keep telling the truth, calmly, consistently." I heard footsteps in the hallway. I lowered my voice further. "He keeps saying I slipped." "That's expected. Gaslighting often begins immediately. Stay steady. The facts are on your side." Gaslighting. I had read about it before. The slow erosion of someone's confidence in their own memory. The way a person insists an event happened differently until you begin doubting yourself. But I remembered the push. I remembered the pressure between my shoulder blades. "I want the trust activated," I said softly. "It already is. The property transferred into the irrevocable trust 3 weeks ago. You signed the final documents in my office, remember?" Yes, I remembered sitting across from her, my hands trembling slightly as I signed. At the time, it felt drastic, final, but necessary. Daniel had no idea. The house was no longer mine in the way he assumed, and it certainly wasn't his. "And the will?" I asked. You updated it that same day, she said gently. Daniel was removed as primary beneficiary. Everything is structured to prevent contesting. A strange mix of grief and relief tightened my chest. I never wanted to remove my own child from my will. That decision had kept me awake for nights, but every conversation about the house, every dismissive remark about my declining memory, every subtle attempt to control my finances had pushed me closer to it. "I'll come to the hospital this afternoon," Margaret continued. "We'll finalize the police report. And Helen, yes, you are not powerless." The words settled deep. After I ended the call, I carefully deleted it from the recent history and placed the phone back on the table. My heart was pounding harder than it had during the fall. Moments later, Daniel stepped back into the room. His expression softened when he saw me awake. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I fell down a flight of stairs," I replied evenly. He forced a small smile. "You gave me a scare." I watched him quietly. He moved around the room as if he belonged there, adjusting the blanket, checking the IV line as though he were the concerned son everyone expected him to be. "You told them I slipped," he said. "You did," he insisted gently. "Mom, you've been tired lately. It happens." I held his gaze. For the first time, I did not argue. I simply nodded slowly, as if considering his version of events. And in that moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Relief. He thought I was starting to doubt myself. He thought the confusion he had been planting for months was finally taking root. He had no idea that while he was crafting his narrative, I had already secured mine. And by the time he realized what I had done, it would be too late. Daniel stayed by my side through the surgery. At least, that's what the nurses told me later. I drifted in and out of consciousness, caught somewhere between anesthesia and memory. When I finally woke in recovery, my hip was bandaged, my shoulder braced, and the pain was wrapped in a heavy fog of medication. But beneath that fog, my resolve felt solid. Daniel leaned forward when he saw my eyes open. "You're okay," he said quickly, almost breathlessly. "The surgery went fine." I studied his face. He looked tired, dark circles beneath his eyes. To anyone watching, he would appear like a devoted son who had just nearly lost his mother. If I didn't know better, I might have believed it too. "Thank you for staying," I murmured. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "Of course I stayed. I'm your son." There it was again, the reminder, as if the title itself excused everything. Later that afternoon, when Daniel stepped out to get coffee, Margaret arrived. She moved quietly into the room, her posture straight, her expression composed but warm. She squeezed my hand gently. "You look stronger than I expected," she said softly. "I feel stronger than I expected," I replied. She pulled a chair closer to the bed and opened a slim leather folder. Inside were copies of documents I had signed months earlier: the trust agreement, the updated will, the notarized statement detailing my concerns about financial pressure from a family member, even the installation contract for the security cameras. "I've already contacted a forensic technician to preserve the footage from the hallway camera," she said. "We reviewed a preliminary clip this morning." My throat tightened. "And?" She held my gaze. "It shows you placing both hands on your back. There's no ambiguity, Helen." For a moment, the room felt very quiet. It wasn't that I doubted my own memory, but hearing it confirmed, seeing that my instinct had not betrayed me, it was both devastating and grounding at the same time. He'll say it was reflex, that he was trying to steady me. He can say whatever he likes, but the footage shows you standing still, it shows you turning away, and it shows you pushing with force. The word force hung in the air. A nurse knocked lightly and entered, checking my vitals. Margaret waited patiently until she left again. I've also drafted a formal statement for you. When you're ready, we can request an officer to take your report here in the hospital. I nodded slowly. I don't want to wait. She studied me carefully. Are you certain? Yes. There was no anger in my voice, no shouting, just certainty. Margaret gave a small, approving nod. All right, I'll arrange it. When Daniel returned with 2 cups of coffee, he found Margaret sitting beside me. His smile faltered. "Oh," he said, "I didn't realize you'd called her." "I wanted legal advice," I replied evenly. He set the cups down a little too quickly. "About what?" Margaret answered before I could. "About her safety." He stiffened. "Her safety? She fell." "No," I said quietly. "I was pushed." His eyes snapped to mine. For a split second, something raw and irritated flashed across his face. Then it vanished, replaced with wounded disbelief. "Mom, please," he said, lowering his voice as if soothing a child. "We've talked about this." Margaret closed her folder deliberately. "Mr. Carter, I strongly suggest you refrain from discussing the incident further. An official report is being filed." The silence that followed felt electric. "You're overreacting." "Am I?" I asked softly. He looked from me to Margaret and back again. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He hadn't expected resistance. He hadn't expected preparation. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. "No," I replied. "I already made one. I trusted you too long." He stepped back slightly, as if the words had physically struck him. For the first time, I saw fear, not concern about my injuries, fear about consequences. Later that evening, a police officer arrived. He spoke gently, respectfully. He asked me to recount what happened in my own words. I did so calmly, clearly, without exaggeration. Daniel attempted to interrupt twice, but the officer held up a hand and asked him to wait. When the officer mentioned reviewing security footage, Daniel's composure cracked just slightly. "Footage?" he repeated. "Yes," the officer said. "Your mother installed cameras." Daniel's eyes flickered towards me, wide and searching. "You installed cameras?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "When?" "A while ago." His face went pale. The officer continued explaining that the footage would be collected and reviewed formally. Daniel insisted again that it was a misunderstanding, that he was only trying to stop me from losing my balance, but his voice no longer carried the same confidence. After the officer left, Daniel stood near the window, staring out into the dark parking lot. "You really think I'd hurt you?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now. I looked at him for a long moment. "I think you wanted something badly enough to convince yourself it didn't matter how you got it." He didn't respond. That night, alone in my hospital room, I stared at the ceiling and felt something unexpected: grief. Not for the house, not for the broken hip, but for the boy who once cried when he accidentally stepped on my foot because he couldn't stand the idea of hurting me. Somewhere along the way, greed had replaced that tenderness, and now, because he believed I was powerless, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The morning after the police report was filed, Daniel did not come to the hospital. For years, I had imagined that if something serious ever happened to me, my son would be the first person at my bedside, refusing to leave. I had pictured him arguing with nurses to make sure I was comfortable, insisting on the best care, holding my hand the way I once held his when he was afraid of the dark. Instead, his absence felt like confirmation. Margaret arrived shortly after breakfast with a measured look on her face. She closed the door behind her before speaking. He's contacted an attorney, she said. I nodded slowly. I expected that. He's claiming confusion. He's suggesting you've been experiencing memory lapses, that you've been paranoid about finances. I let out a quiet breath. Of course he is. Margaret studied me carefully. This may get uncomfortable. He could attempt to challenge your competency. There it was, the strategy I had feared. If he could paint me as mentally unstable, then everything I'd done, the trust, the will update, the police report, could be questioned. I want a full cognitive evaluation, I said immediately. She smiled faintly. I already requested one. By the afternoon, a hospital psychologist had arrived, a calm woman with kind eyes and a clipboard. She asked me to remember sequences of numbers, to describe current events, to solve small logic puzzles, to recall details from my childhood. I answered steadily, clearly. Even through the ache in my hip and the exhaustion from surgery, my mind remained sharp. When she finished, she set her pen down and looked at me directly. "You are cognitively sound, Mrs. Carter," she said. "There's no indication of confusion or impairment." I felt something loosen inside my chest. Margaret requested a written copy immediately. Later that evening, Daniel finally appeared. He looked different, not disheveled, composed but colder, controlled. He stood at the foot of my bed instead of beside it. "You've made this very serious," he said quietly. "You made it serious when you pushed me," I replied. His eyes hardened. "I didn't push you." The camera disagrees. For a moment, silence stretched between us. "You set me up," he said. I almost laughed at that. "I installed cameras because I was afraid of you." His expression flickered, just briefly. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he insisted. "Families argue, people get emotional." "Families don't send each other down flights of stairs," I said calmly. He exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "Do you know what people are going to think? That I'm some kind of monster?" I looked at him carefully. "I'm more concerned with what actually happened than what people think." He stared at me as if he didn't recognize the woman in the bed. Perhaps he didn't. For months I had been accommodating, gentle, avoidant of conflict, hoping he would come back to himself. But something had shifted in me at the bottom of those stairs. Pain has a way of stripping away illusions. "I needed that house," he said suddenly, his voice dropping. "Do you understand that? I needed security." "You had security. You had a mother who would have helped you if you asked." "I was tired of asking," he snapped. There it was. Not desperation, entitlement. "You were tired of waiting," I corrected softly. His silence confirmed it. He didn't deny wanting the house. He didn't deny pressuring me. He only denied the push. Margaret stepped in the next morning with final updates. "The trust is fully protected," she said. "Given the circumstances, we've added additional clauses to prevent any attempt at contesting based on coercion or incompetence." "And the house?" I asked. "It remains under the trust's ownership, and given the police report and footage, we can proceed with a formal eviction." The word eviction felt heavy, final. "He lives there," I said quietly. "He assaulted the homeowner," she replied gently. "Legally and morally, you are within your rights." I closed my eyes briefly. I had imagined many futures for my son. Success, marriage, children, redemption after hardship. I had never imagined serving him eviction papers. But I also never imagined he would risk my life for square footage and equity. "When?" I asked. "As soon as you approve." I opened my eyes again. Do it. Margaret nodded. 2 days later, while I was still in the hospital recovering, Daniel was served official notice. He called me immediately, his voice shaking with fury. "You're throwing me out?" he demanded. "I'm protecting myself," I answered. "You're my mother." "Yes," I said softly, "and you forgot what that meant." He began shouting then, about betrayal, about humiliation, about how he was ruining his life. I listened quietly until he ran out of words. When he finally paused, breathless, I said only this: "I loved you enough to give you everything once. I love myself enough not to let you take it by force." Then I ended the call. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because for the first time in months, I felt steady. He thought I was weak. He thought a fall down the stairs would silence me. Instead, it awakened me, and he still had no idea what was coming next. The hospital discharged me 10 days after the surgery. I wasn't strong enough to return home immediately, so I was transferred to a rehabilitation facility across town. The room was smaller, quieter, and for the first time in weeks, I was alone without Daniel hovering nearby. Alone, but not afraid. Margaret visited the morning after I arrived. She closed the blinds halfway before sitting down, as if instinctively creating a shield between me and the outside world. "He's moved out," she said. The words settled slowly. "Already?" He didn't have much choice. The eviction notice was firm, and given the police report, his attorney advised compliance. I nodded, absorbing it. "Did he damage anything?" I asked quietly. Margaret's pause gave me my answer before she spoke. "Some things were broken. A lamp, a kitchen chair, nothing structural. Mostly anger." I closed my eyes briefly. I could picture it clearly, him pacing through the living room, resentment simmering, the walls that once held his childhood echoing with bitterness instead of laughter. "He blames you," she added carefully. "Of course he does." There was no bitterness in my voice, only a tired understanding. People who refuse accountability often redirect it. "What about the investigation?" I asked. "The footage has been formally logged as evidence. The district attorney will review whether to pursue charges. Given your injuries and the clarity of the video, it's likely." Likely. The word carried weight. Pressing charges against my own son was not something I had ever imagined, but the fall had not been minor. My hip fracture would affect my mobility for the rest of my life. The surgeon had said as much. "He could go to jail," I said quietly. "Yes." The room felt still. "I don't want revenge," I said after a moment. Margaret studied me gently. "This isn't revenge, it's consequence." I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. They looked older than I remembered, veins more visible, skin thinner, but they were steady. "He needs to understand that actions have weight," she continued softly. "Without that understanding, he will hurt someone else one day." That thought lingered long after she left. Rehabilitation was slow, painful. The physical therapist pushed me harder than I expected. Each step with the walker felt like a negotiation between my body and my will, but I refused to surrender to weakness. I had survived something more dangerous than broken bones. Word spread through the family quickly. My sister called in tears. My niece sent flowers. Even distant cousins reached out. Most were shocked. Some were silent in that uncomfortable way people become when they don't know where to place blame. Daniel called once during my second week at the facility. I let it ring the first time. He left a voicemail. "Mom, I don't know how this got so out of control," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I never meant for you to get hurt. I needed things to move forward. I felt stuck. Stuck, as if my existence had been an obstacle. I'll talk to the prosecutor. If you drop the charges, we can settle this privately. We can fix it." Fix it. I listened to the message twice, then I deleted it. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. He wasn't apologizing for pushing me. He was apologizing for the consequences. A week later, Margaret informed me that the district attorney had officially filed charges for aggravated assault against an elderly person. The phrase felt clinical, detached, but the weight of it was real. Daniel's attorney requested mediation. I agreed to meet. The meeting took place in a neutral conference room. I arrived with Margaret and a walker. Daniel was already seated when we entered. He looked thinner. His confidence had dimmed, replaced with brittle tension. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked me directly. "I never wanted it to go this far," he said. "Neither did I replied. His attorney began discussing plea options, potential reduced charges if responsibility was acknowledged. Words like probation and restitution floated across the table. But I wasn't listening to the legal language. I was watching my son's face. "Why?" I asked him quietly. The room stilled. "Why did you push me?" His jaw tightened. He was angry, he admitted after a long silence. "You wouldn't listen," I said calmly. "I was listening, I just wasn't agreeing." He looked down at his hands. "I felt like you didn't trust me." "I didn't," I answered gently. The honesty seemed to wound him more than accusation ever could. "You were choosing a house over me," he said. "No," I replied softly. "I was choosing boundaries." He shook his head faintly, as if trying to understand a language he had never learned. "I thought if the house was mine, I could finally breathe, and I would have been gone?" I asked. He didn't answer. That silence was louder than anything else. The mediation ended without resolution. The legal process would continue. As Margaret and I walked out of the building, I felt an unexpected calm. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but peace. Because for the first time since he moved back home, I no longer felt manipulated, cornered, or doubting myself. He thought I was powerless. He thought I would be too ashamed to act. Instead, I stood in truth. And whatever the court decided next, one thing was certain. I would never again allow my love for my child to become permission for my own harm. The court date was set for early autumn. By then, I was back home. Walking through my front door for the first time after everything felt surreal. The house smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. My sister had arranged for a cleaning service while I was in rehabilitation. The broken lamp had been replaced, the kitchen chair repaired, but there were small details no one else would notice. The slight scratch along the hallway wall where the stretcher must have brushed it, the faint scuff on the basement door. I stood there with my cane, breathing in the silence. For the first time in months, the house felt like mine again, not contested, not watched, not measured in terms of equity in square footage, just mine. Margaret had recommended additional security measures, stronger locks, an alarm system. I agreed, not because I believed Daniel would return violently, but because reclaiming peace sometimes requires practical steps. The basement stairs had been fitted with brighter lighting and a reinforced railing. I avoided looking down them for several days. When I finally did, I stood at the top and forced myself to remember, not the fall, but the moment before it, the certainty in my refusal, the strength in my voice. I would not let that staircase become a symbol of fear. Daniel had moved into a small apartment across town. Through relatives, I heard that he was struggling financially. His reputation had taken a hit once the story circulated. Employers are cautious about hiring someone facing assault charges, especially involving a parent. Some family members reached out to me quietly. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" my cousin Linda asked gently one afternoon. "He's still your son." "Yes," I replied. They expected anger from me, bitterness, but what they encountered instead unsettled them more. Calm. "I don't hate him," I told her, "but I won't protect him from consequences." The court proceedings began without drama. The footage was reviewed, the medical records presented, the psychologist's evaluation submitted, confirming my full cognitive competence at the time of the incident. Daniel avoided my eyes most of the time. When it was his turn to speak, he did not deny pushing me. Instead, he framed it as a moment of emotional overwhelm. "I didn't mean for her to fall," he said, voice tight. "I just reacted." Reacted, as if gravity was incidental. The prosecutor was measured but firm. "A push at the top of a staircase carries foreseeable harm," she stated. "Intent does not erase impact." I sat quietly through it all. When asked if I wished to address the court, I stood slowly, leaning on my cane. I loved my son enough to trust him in my home, and I love him now enough to tell the truth. What happened that night was not confusion, it was not imbalance, it was a choice made in anger and entitlement. I survived, but I will live with the physical consequences of that choice for the rest of my life. I paused, steadying myself. I do not ask for revenge, I ask for accountability, because if he cannot face it now, he will repeat it. The courtroom was silent when I sat back down. The ruling was delivered a week later. Daniel was sentenced to probation, mandatory counseling, community service, and financial restitution for medical costs not covered by insurance. There would be no prison time unless he violated the terms. Some people thought I should feel relieved. Others thought I should feel disappointed. What I felt was something else entirely. Closure. The restitution payments began the following month. Each check felt symbolic, not because I needed the money, but because it represented acknowledgement, responsibility quantified. Daniel did not contact me for several weeks after the sentencing. Then, one evening, my phone rang. I stared at his name on the screen for a long moment before answering. "Hello?" There was a long silence before he spoke. "I started counseling," he said. "That's good," I replied evenly. "They say I have issues with control," he added, almost bitterly. I allowed a small, sad smile. "That sounds accurate." He exhaled softly, almost a huff of reluctant agreement. I didn't realize how much resentment I'd built up. I felt like I was still that kid waiting for something, waiting to feel secure. "You were never waiting. You just didn't like the timing." Another silence. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "You can't fix it. You can only change who you are moving forward." The conversation was not emotional. It was not tearful. It was two adults speaking plainly. Before hanging up, he said something unexpected. "I didn't think you'd fight back." The honesty in that statement settled heavily between us. "I didn't think I would have to," I answered. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room, listening to the clock tick. He thought I was weak. He thought love meant compliance. He thought age meant surrender. He was wrong. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding not just my strength, but my life beyond him. I rejoined my book club. I started volunteering at the local library once a week. I even began attending a small support group for seniors who had experienced financial or emotional manipulation by family members. I was not alone. That realization changed something in me. My story, painful as it was, carried weight. It carried warning. It carried proof that quiet preparation and steady resolve can protect you even when betrayal comes from your own blood. And though my relationship with Daniel would never return to what it once was, something healthier was beginning to take shape. Boundaries. And for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace inside my own home. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges, but it does not erase what carved them. 3 months after the sentencing, autumn settled fully over the neighborhood. The maple tree in my front yard turned a deep, stubborn red. I watched the leaves fall one afternoon from my living room window, Kane resting beside me, tea cooling in my hands, and I realized something unexpected. I no longer felt tense in my own home. For nearly a year before the fall, I had lived with a low, constant anxiety, a quiet scanning of moods, a careful choice of words, a hesitation before answering simple questions about finances or plans. I hadn't named it at the time. I told myself it was just adjustment, just compromise. But now, in the stillness, I understood. I had been shrinking. Not physically, but emotionally. Reducing myself to avoid triggering frustration, softening opinions, deferring decisions, all in an effort to keep peace with someone who had already decided peace was less valuable than control. I refused to shrink anymore. Daniel's counseling sessions became part of our occasional conversations. He called every 2 weeks at first, then once a week. The tone was different now, less defensive, less polished. I didn't realize how much I'd tied my worth to what I owned, he admitted one evening. The house felt like proof that I'd finally made it. You were measuring success with the wrong ruler, I replied gently. There was no warmth in my voice, but there wasn't cruelty either, just truth. He didn't argue. He had begun working again, nothing glamorous but steady. He mentioned budgeting, downsizing expectations. For the first time, he sounded less entitled and more reflective. But trust does not regenerate overnight. When he asked if he could visit, I set conditions. Public place, daytime, 1 hour. He agreed without protest. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes. He arrived early. When he stood to greet me, there was hesitation in his posture, almost uncertainty. "I'm glad you came," he said. "So am I," I replied. We spoke about neutral things at first, work, the weather, his therapy sessions. He mentioned his counselor had challenged him to examine his anger at waiting for life to begin. I kept thinking once I had the house, once I had stability handed to me, I'd finally feel secure, he said quietly. But that thinking was twisted. "Yes," I said simply. He looked at me then directly. I was angry that you still controlled it, like it meant I was still a child. The irony almost made me smile. You became a child when you tried to take it, not when you didn't have it. He absorbed that without defensiveness. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the boy I once knew, not in innocence, but in humility. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Not rushed, not pressured, just spoken. I studied him carefully. "Are you sorry you pushed me?" I asked quietly, "or sorry you got caught?" He held my gaze longer this time. "I'm sorry I believed you were in my way," he answered. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest. We did not hug when we parted. We did not pretend everything was healed. But something small had shifted. Accountability had taken root. Back at home, I continued building my own life with intention. I organized my financial records meticulously. I met with Margaret once more to ensure every legal safeguard was current and airtight. The trust remained unchanged. The will remained firm. I also did something new. I began speaking at the senior support group about my experience, not dramatically, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Preparation is not paranoia. Documentation is not distrust. Boundaries are not cruelty. Several women nodded through tears. One gentleman approached me afterward and whispered, "I thought I was the only one whose son tried to manipulate me." You're never the only one, I realized. Silence protects the wrong people. Months passed. My mobility improved steadily. I could climb the basement stairs again, slowly, gripping the railing firmly. The first time I reached the bottom without fear, I stood there for a long moment and let myself breathe. He thought pushing me down would break me. Instead, it clarified me. Daniel continued probation without violations. Restitution payments arrived on schedule. Our conversations remained cautious but respectful. He never again mentioned the house. And one evening, as winter began to settle in, he said something that told me more than any apology could. "I don't expect anything from you anymore," he said quietly over the phone. "I need to build my own life." "Yes," I replied softly, "you do." After we hung up, I sat by the fireplace and reflected on everything that had unfolded. Love does not mean surrendering safety. Motherhood does not mean tolerating harm. And age does not mean vulnerability unless you choose silence over strength. I once believed protecting my son meant shielding him from consequences. Now I understand that real protection sometimes means allowing him to face them. The house remains in the trust, my boundaries remain intact, and my heart, though scarred, is steady. Because sometimes the child you raised forgets who raised them, and sometimes it takes one fall and one call to remind them. Spring returned quietly the following year. The maple tree in my yard bloomed again, its branches heavy with fresh green leaves that swayed gently in the warm breeze. I stood outside one morning with my cane resting against the porch railing, breathing in the scent of damp earth and renewal. Life had moved forward, not perfectly, not without reminders, but forward. Daniel had come to visit 2 weeks earlier. It was the first time he stepped into my home since the eviction. He paused at the doorway for a long moment before entering, almost as if crossing a threshold that symbolized more than physical space. "I feel different walking in here now," he admitted quietly. "Good," I replied. "You should." He nodded slowly. We sat in the living room, not speaking at first. The silence between us no longer felt tense. It felt measured, respectful. He glanced toward the basement door. "I used to think that room represented something I could control," he said. "It represents storage, nothing more." He let out a faint, almost embarrassed laugh. The therapist had encouraged him to acknowledge responsibility directly to me, without excuses. So he tried. "I understand now that when I pushed you, I wasn't reacting to danger. I was reacting to frustration." I watched his face for any trace of deflection. "And," I prompted gently, "and that frustration came from feeling entitled to outcomes instead of earning them." His honesty surprised me. "Good," I said. There was no applause, no dramatic forgiveness. Growth does not require celebration. It requires consistency. He asked me something unexpected next. "Do you ever regret calling the police?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I answered after a moment. If I had stayed silent, you would have learned that you can cross boundaries without consequence. He swallowed. And do you regret the consequences? I met his eyes. I regret that it had to come to that. That distinction mattered. Our relationship was no longer defined by control or dependency. It existed now on terms built around accountability and mutual respect. We were rebuilding, not restoring what was lost, but constructing something healthier. One afternoon, while we were sitting at the kitchen table reviewing old family photographs, Daniel pointed to a picture of himself at age 8. He was standing beside me, holding a small trophy from a school competition. I was kneeling next to him, smiling proudly. "Back then," he said softly, "I never doubted that you were on my side." I replied, "You still can." He looked at me with something fragile in his eyes. "Even after everything?" "Yes," I said. "But being on your side doesn't mean protecting you from your own mistakes." He nodded slowly, absorbing that truth. I had learned something important through this ordeal. Love without boundaries becomes enabling, and boundaries without love become cruelty. The balance is delicate, but essential. Financially, the trust remained secure. Legally, everything had been finalized. There were no pending disputes, no further challenges from Daniel's attorney. The system had processed the case, documented the harm, and enforced consequences. But the most significant change was not legal. It was internal. I no longer scanned my surroundings for potential threats within my own home. I no longer questioned my memory when someone contradicted me. I no longer felt obligated to justify my decisions to protect my independence. Instead, I felt grounded, empowered. One evening, months after our first confrontation in court, Daniel sat across from me and said quietly, "I'm not asking for ownership anymore. I'm asking for relationship." His words were simple but meaningful. "Good," I replied, "because relationships are earned through behavior, not inheritance." He smiled faintly at that. There were still moments of awkwardness between us, moments where old resentment flickered briefly before being replaced by understanding. Healing is rarely linear. Some days feel strong, others feel fragile. But we kept choosing dialogue over defensiveness. I also continued mentoring other seniors in the support group, sharing practical steps I had taken. Document concerns early. Update legal protections before conflict escalates. Install security measures if instincts warn you. Trust patterns, not promises. Many people approached me privately after meetings and confessed fears about their own adult children. "I love my daughter," one woman told me quietly, "but she pressures me about my property." I responded gently, "Love her, but protect yourself." That became my quiet mission, to teach others that protecting assets and autonomy is not betrayal. It is wisdom. As for Daniel, he gradually rebuilt stability in his own life. He moved into a modest apartment. He saved money responsibly. He avoided risky financial decisions. His therapy sessions continued. His attitude shifted from resistance to reflection. One day, he made a statement that surprised me deeply. "If I ever have children, I want them to feel safe with me, not afraid of losing control." I looked at him carefully. "That starts now," I replied. He understood. Months turned into a year. The legal case eventually closed completely. Probation conditions were set aside. Restitution completed. The record remained, but it no longer dominated our conversations. Peace did not mean forgetting. It meant acknowledging the past, without letting it dictate the future. Sometimes I walk to the top of the basement stairs and pause deliberately. I no longer feel fear there. I feel awareness. That place reminds me of how quickly trust can fracture and how decisively I responded when it did. My son pushed me. It changed our lives forever, but it also forced us to confront truths we had avoided for years. He learned accountability. I learned self-protection. And together, we learned that love survives not through denial, but through honesty and boundaries. If there is one lesson I carry from that night, it is this: you can forgive someone without restoring access to harm. You can love someone without surrendering your safety. And sometimes, one painful fall and one decisive phone call can transform a broken relationship into something stronger than it ever was before. The house is still standing. I am still standing. And so is my resolve.